In 1934, a book was published that would go on to cause social outrage and legal controversy. It would shock its readers with its blunt, explicit language and its graphic portrayal of sex. It would say the unsayable. The book was this one, Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. And here is an extract from the very first chapter. Oh, Tanya, where now is that warm cunt of yours? Those fat, heavy garters, those soft, bulging thighs. There is a bone in my prick, 6 inches long. I will ream out every wrinkle in your cunt, Tanya, big with seed. I will send you home to your Sylvester with an ache in your belly and your womb turned inside out. Your Sylvester, yes, he knows how to build a fire. But I know how to inflame a cunt. Strong stuff. And if you think that's shocking today, imagine the effect it had more than 80 years ago. It's one of the most influential novels of the 20th century, and Miller's unflinching prose sent shockwaves throughout the literary world. But in 1934, a book using such language was unprintable in London or New York. Instead, it was published in Paris by a short-sighted dandy from Manchester called Jack Kahane. Paris between the wars was a city teeming with highbrows and lowlifes, crooks and contessas, junkies and jazzmen, and writers. Lots and lots of writers. And into this world wandered Kahane, a failed playwright, a failed novelist, a lover of great literature, and a shrewd businessman who knew that sex sells and who wasn't averse to selling dirty books alongside some of the 20th century's most important works of literature. This is the story of a man whom I believe to be one of the most important and unlikely figures in the history of literary censorship. My name is Neil Pearson. I'm mostly an actor, but for many years I've been interested in antiquarian books. I collect them, I deal in them, and I love what they tell us about our literary history. And one publishing house in particular has always fascinated me, the Obelisk Press. It was founded by Jack Kahane. Born in Manchester in 1887 to a prosperous Romanian Jewish textile family, Kahane fell in love with music and theatre from an early age. He spent his adolescent years actively promoting his home city as a harbour of literary and musical culture, and promoting himself as a young man about town, challenging authorities, setting up cultural societies, and trying his hand at playwriting. But Kahane's special love of French culture lit a passion for the country itself, and in 1914, the very existence of France was under threat. Full of the sort of boyish idealism that was likely to get you killed, Kahane was desperate to see frontline action. In 1916, he got his wish, somewhere out there on the killing fields of the Great War. At Ypres, he was gassed, then badly wounded by an exploding shell. He spent several months in a military hospital, the rest of the war behind the front line, and the rest of his life dealing with the permanent effect on his physical and mental health. But amid all the carnage, one good thing happened. Towards the end of the war, he married Marcelle Giraudias, the French daughter of a wealthy railway engineer. For the rest of his life, Kahane's adopted country would be his permanent home. And for a would-be writer and bohemian at the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, Paris was definitely the place to be. If a cabbie in a time machine ever pulled up alongside me and said, "Where to?" I wouldn't have to think very long. Carrefour de Vavin, s'il vous plaît, l'année 1926. OK, très bien. After the carnage of the Great War, young people were looking to forget, and thousands upon thousands of them chose to forget in Paris. The exchange rate was fantastic, accommodation was plentiful and cheap, and everything a young person needs for a good time was readily available. They didn't just come to forget. Many came to write. Paris was the literary epicenter of a new movement, modernism, which was embracing freedom and experimentation. This was the world of Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway and James Joyce. And like moths to a flame, they were all drawn here, to the Boulevard du Montparnasse. Writer and historian John Baxter is an expert on the city's more disreputable past. So, John, it's a Saturday night, and here we are in Montparnasse in the mid-1920s. Paint the picture for me.
Okay, we're at the very crossroads of Bohemian Paris. In the Rotonde Cafe here, the Spaniards would be carousing. There'd be Salvador Dali, Louis Buñuel. Here in the Select, every drunk prostitute, pickpocket and general layabout would be looking for a way to make some money. And over here in the Coupole, the Americans would be flooding in, looking for a tremendous night which would begin with cocktails and end at 4 a.m. with them dancing in the dance hall underneath. So everybody was having a great time. This was like Soho in the 1890s, like Greenwich Village in the 1950s. If you were young and you wanted to be where it was happening, this was where it was happening.
Paris in the 1920s was the crossroads at which all the arts met, cross-pollinated and experimented. And for an aspiring writer like Jack Kahane, his adopted city provided a literary freedom that couldn't be found back home. In Britain and the United States, this was still an extremely restrictive time to be a writer. As far as the authorities were concerned, it was the writer's job to reflect the values of his country, not challenge them. Publishers were regularly taken to court, and books which seemed innocuous even by the standards of the day could be prosecuted for obscenity, blasphemy, promoting immorality, sometimes all three. But on this side of the channel, things were different. In 1922, a book which was unprintable both in the US and the UK was published here in Paris. And the way it was published would later have a profound effect on Jack Kahane. The book was Ulysses by James Joyce. In 1920, excerpts from the unpublished novel appeared in an American magazine, which was promptly prosecuted. A masterpiece it may have been, but it was still unprintable on either side of the Atlantic. It's impossible to find a passage in Ulysses which is obviously offensive, but that didn't stop the censors trying. However obliquely, Joyce was writing about masturbation and casual sex, and that was enough to get him prosecuted. In France, the obscenity laws were as stringent as they were anywhere else, but there was an important loophole. They were only ever used against work published in French. If you published in English in Paris, you could publish pretty much what you wanted. And as long as you didn't send the books abroad, you wouldn't be prosecuted. In 1922, the owner of a small bookshop in Paris decided to use this loophole to publish one of the greatest books of the 20th century. Her name was Sylvia Beach, and the bookshop was called Shakespeare and Company. At the beginning of the 1920s, Beach's shop was here on the Rue de l'Odéon, and it quickly became the headquarters of Paris's English-speaking literary community. With Ulysses, it had also become the city's most daring publishing house, and where Beach led, many other young publishers quickly followed, printing books unpublishable anywhere else. A literary party had begun, but poor Jack Kahane wasn't around to get his invitation. So where was he? The family's archives contain a treasure trove of photos from this time, and amongst the pictures of Jack and Marcel, there are a few which explain his temporary exile from the City of Light. In the early 1920s, Kahane's health had deteriorated. The war had left him with only one lung, and in 1919, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, at that time an incurable disease. He was sent to a sanatorium in sleepy rural France, a long way from the bright lights of Paris. And while the rest of the world was getting to know James Joyce, he was becoming addicted to a very different kind of fiction. He became addicted to light French novels, very light French novels, like this one.
The book's plots were virtually interchangeable. They all featured pretty young girls, their fearsome mothers, and handsome but disreputable young men chasing each other through country houses and nightclubs.
So far, so P.G. Wodehouse, but these books had an added ingredient: sex. They weren't explicit, but they were saucy. A chapter would end with the lovers outside the bedroom door, and the next chapter would begin with them happily sitting up in bed having breakfast. Across the channel, books had been banned for less, but Kahane saw a business opportunity.
In the straight-laced, censorious world of the British literary scene, there was no equivalent to this kind of novel. So he wrote one of his own, Laugh and Grow Rich. The book is a frothy, mildly sexy romp about two young things in Paris and kept just the right side of what was permissible in the UK. Published in London in 1923, it was well reviewed and ran to 3 editions. For the first and only time in his life, the writer Jack Kahane was a hit.
I particularly like this bit here. It was now 10:30, and taking down the telephone receiver, I asked to be put through to her room. After a few moments, she answered. "Oh, is it you? How early you are. I've had to dash out of my bath to answer you. I want to know if I may come and see you. Not just yet, for I'm standing here dressed simply in drops of water." I grunted. If a telephone were only a telescope as well. Well, it wasn't Ulysses, but it wasn't meant to be. Kahane had finished the novel he'd set out to write, and people were buying it.
But modest success wasn't enough. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to be James Joyce. He tried his hand at more serious novels, all of which fell flat. By the late 1920s, he was forced to admit defeat.
Jack Kahane, the writer, was dead in the water. If he wanted to be successful, he'd have to try something else.
In 1929, he had an idea. He convinced his father-in-law to bankroll his stake in a publishing house that produced glossy éditions de luxe, coffee table art books in French and English that were much in vogue at that time. Kahane was finally ready to return to Paris, this time as a publisher. But, as usual, his timing was a little off.
There have been better years to start a new business than the year of the Wall Street crash. Wealthy young expatriates were wealthy no more and headed for home. Paris emptied, and the market for English-language books collapsed. The party was over.
So far, Kahane had relied on support from his wife's rich father. But with the family business in turmoil, that source of income was rapidly drying up. Kahane had a family to feed and needed to make money fast. Luckily, he had a plan.
While Wall Street crashed, Kahane was closely following a scandal across the channel, caused by a book which had been seized before publication. But they missed this copy. Sleeveless Errand by Nora James, a morbid story about a man and a woman who embark on a suicide pact.
According to an influential 1868 ruling in the British courts, the test of obscenity was whether the material intends to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences.
But it's hard to see this book as being likely to deprave or corrupt, even by the standards of 1929. Occasionally, someone will say hell or bitch, but nothing stronger, and no one has sex. Kahane managed to get hold of his own copy, and when he read it, he saw not so much a great novel,
as a fantastic opportunity. He was certain that the subject matter wouldn't raise an eyebrow in France, and he bought the rights off the UK publisher at a knockdown price. He printed his own edition here in Paris and sold it to expatriates and English-speaking tourists eager to see what all the fuss was about. It carried this wraparound band, cleverly proclaiming that this was the version which had been seized by the London police. It sold very well, and in 1931, Kahane bought out his business partner and founded a new publishing house based on this daring new business model. He called it the Obelisk Press. The inspiration for the company's name and logo came from the obelisk here in the Place de la Concorde. Given what he would go on to publish, it's a suitably phallic symbol. Kahane hadn't gone into business to publish dirty books, but he wasn't stupid. Sex sells. He knew that the racier the novel, the quicker it would sell, and over the course of his publishing career, he certainly printed his fair share of smut. So, how saucy is saucy? Well, Kahane signed up a list of authors who would write memoirs and fiction of a saucy nature for him. Among them, N. Reynolds Packard, who, when he wasn't filing copy for American newspapers, would write of his exploits across Europe as the Marco Polo of sex. And when the supply of racy novels threatened to dry up, Kahane solved the problem by writing one himself under a pseudonym. This is Gold and Silver by Henry Bridges, aka Jack Kahane. It's an everyday story of casual sex, cocaine, and lesbianism on the Côte d'Azur. Taking her in his arms, he put her on the bed, where he began undressing her, awkwardly, hesitatingly, embracing her as he took off every scrap of clothing. His desire becoming ever greater, it was short work to have her naked before him, her beautiful body more beautiful than he had realized, at his mercy. Almost gloatingly, he allowed his hands to wander over her. He began undressing. "No," exclaimed Madeline, "I can't bear that. There's a dressing room over there." Disappointing. By today's standards, most of these titles are quite tame, end-of-the-pier smut, rather than out-and-out porn. They may have paid the bills, but Kahane wanted to do more. He wanted to make a lasting contribution to literature, and so alongside the smut, he reprinted notoriously banned books such as Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, 24 years before it was legally available in the UK. And then in 1932, a brand new manuscript landed on his desk, which would raise the stakes significantly. It was written by a middle-aged, unpublished American writer down on his luck. Like Kahane, Henry Miller had turned up late to the party, settling in Paris at a time when most expatriates were leaving. Miller, penniless and with absolutely no plan, threw himself into the seedy underbelly of Paris. And Paris rewarded him with the material for his first novel. Tropic of Cancer is a seething picaresque in which the city of Paris is as much character as setting. It's a Paris seen mostly at night, a Paris teeming with artists and writers, pimps and whores, highbrows and lowlifes. The book is a candid chronicle of Miller's life at the time he was writing it, up to and including the sex. Lots and lots of sex. Tropic of Cancer was clearly unique, clearly brilliant, and clearly unpublishable. Miller's literary agent William Bradley was convinced of the first two, but sent the manuscript to Jack Kahane anyway, hoping he would disagree with the third. Kahane read it in one sitting. Later, he would call it the most terrible, the most sordid, the most magnificent manuscript that had ever fallen into his hands. Kahane knew it was a masterpiece.
but he also knew it was way more incendiary than anything he'd published so far. It would be the first real test of the censor's patience, a test that would put his entire business at risk. He decided it was a risk worth taking, and in 1934, he changed the course of literary history. Okay, so this is the first edition of Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, published by the Obelisk Press in Paris on the 1st of September 1934. I think this is beautiful. Let me try to convince you. It's not pretty to look at. It's a little dog-eared, it's a little dowdy, and it's a badly made paperback. Also, the illustration is appalling. It was done by Maurice Kahane, Jack's then 14-year-old son, and it shows nothing so much as a complete misunderstanding of the book. It shows a great big crab, cancer, get it? And in its pincers, it holds a lifeless woman. It bears absolutely no relation to anything in the book. In monetary terms, this is probably worth now about £10,000. It was published in a limited edition of only 1,000 copies. Probably about half of those were read to death. Probably about half of those that remained were destroyed by customs or the postal service. And of those that remain, most are now in institutional libraries, which is where they should be because they'll be preserved forever. Before this copy existed, Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller didn't exist except in Henry Miller's imagination. That makes it beautiful. And the fact that this is still here is more beautiful still. The first edition of Tropic of Cancer is a powerfully evocative object, but it's much more than that. It kick-started a literary revolution. Andrew Hussey is a professor at the University of London's Institute in Paris and an expert on the work of Henry Miller. What was different about the style of Tropic of Cancer that hadn't come before?
If you go back to the 1930s, it's going to be very hard to find out how people spoke, whether in England or America, because literature doesn't recreate that properly. Joyce does a little bit, but in a very different sort of way. The language of the streets is not something that writers do, but Miller does that. And Miller talks about the electric heat of the streets, and this is something you can actually feel, you know, through the text.
Can you show us an example of that?
If memory serves, I think on page 247, but I've been very careful.
Yes.
With this.
There you go.
Okay. On a damp winter's night, it's not necessary to look at a map to discover the latitude of Paris. It's a northern city, an outpost erected over a swamp filled in with skulls and bones. Along the boulevards, there is a cold electrical imitation of heat. Tout va bien, in ultraviolet rays that make the clients of the Dupont chain cafes look like gangrened cadavers. Wherever there are lights, there's a little heat. One gets warm from watching the fat, secure bastards down their grogs, their steaming black coffees. Where the lights are people on the sidewalks, jostling one another, giving off a little animal heat through their dirty underwear and their foul, cursing breaths. That is superb prose.
What influence did Henry Miller have on literary movements, especially American literary movements that came after him?
Well, he's claimed his influence on the Beat generation, and I think that's certainly true. And the leaders of the Beat generation, that's Burroughs, Kerouac and Ginsberg, they certainly read Miller. What they took from Miller was a sensibility, a rebel sensibility, if you like, an outsider kind of voice. But the prose doesn't match up. I think Miller is superior to all of them in lots of different ways. And in a way, I would jump over the Beat generation and look at the voices in contemporary American literature. And I'm thinking of people like David Foster Wallace with Infinite Jest. Miller didn't invent all of this, but like all great artists, he gave a voice to what needed to be done.
At last, Obelisk had on its list what Kahane had craved for so long, a modern literary classic with a scandalous reputation and sales to match. Its success now made Obelisk a port of call for all literary editors with difficult books to place. The money generated by the lighter, frothier fiction now allowed Kahane to take a punt on writers of genuine literary merit who couldn't get published anywhere else. Over the next few years, he would publish first editions by writers like Lawrence Durrell, Aeneas Nin, even James Joyce himself. Obelisk's roster of authors began to read like a who's who of interwar literary heavyweights. But it wouldn't last for long.
At the end of the 1920s, the Depression had seen many expatriates leave for home. At the end of the 1930s, a very different threat was looming. War was in the air, and in Germany, dangerous books had dangerous consequences. Undeterred, Kahane moved his offices here to the suicidally expensive Place Vendôme, where his rackety book business briefly rubbed shoulders with Cartier and Chanel. By now, what little health he had was failing fast. For all the success he'd had as a publisher, he was still haunted by his own personal failure as a writer. In 1937, he published his last novel. Lady Take Heed appeared under the pseudonym Cecil Barr, but its mood is far from light. The bright young things have all gone home to be replaced by young women murdering abusive stepfathers, only to fall into the hands of abusive brothel keepers. It's a story of broken dreams and frustrated desires. And to whom does Cecil Barr dedicate it? To Jack Kahane, without whose deep knowledge and wide experience of the subject, this book could never have been written. Kahane's poor health, which had haunted him all his life, continued to deteriorate. And on the 3rd of September 1939, the very day war was declared, Jack Kahane died of heart failure. Within a few months, German troops had entered his beloved Paris. Kahane's son, Maurice, wrote the letter informing Obelisk's clients of its founder's death. Once the war was over, he would continue his father's work. In 1953, he established the Olympia Press, and copying his father's tried and tested business model, published incendiary books that no one else would touch. The spirit of Jack Kahane lived on. Kahane's ambition had been to become a great writer. Instead, he became one of the most influential publishers of the 20th century. The books he printed challenged what was acceptable in literature, and their impact resonated long after his death. In 1960, more than 20 years after it was published by the Obelisk Press, a landmark court case allowed Lady Chatterley's Lover to be sold in the UK. And 4 years later, the US Supreme Court finally ruled that Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer was not obscene. The rules that had constrained freedom of expression for so long had begun to fall apart. Kahane was a man of romantic ideals, but realistic expectations. Yes, he was called a pornographer, but that was only ever a means to a much more ambitious end. He was a man who loved literature, who loved art, and who was prepared to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in order to bring us some of the most important books of the 20th century. He may have failed as a writer, but Jack Kahane should be remembered as one of the most radical, pioneering publishers in literary history.